Welcome to Madison Hills Christian Church Online, #HousePartyChurch. We're glad you chose to join us this week. We hope that you guys are safe and we hope that you're well. And we want you to know how much we miss you and how much we want soon to be back together. But we're not going to do so until it's safe to do so, until we can meet all of the guidelines and restrictions, until we're released. But we can't wait for that day to come and see you again. But until that day, join us again for online #HousePartyChurch.
You've done for me. Who brings our chaos back into order? Who makes the orphan a son and daughter? The King of glory, the King of glory, who rules the nations with truth and justice. Shines like the sun in all of his brilliance. The King of glory, the King above all kings. This is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You laid down your life, that I would be set free. Whoa, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the King who conquered the grave. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy, worthy, worthy. Oh, this is amazing grace. This is unfailing love, that you would take my place, that you would bear my cross. You would lay down your life, that I would be set free. Oh, Jesus, I sing for all that you've done for me. was heavy, my chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan. Now you called me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you call my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day.
I like that.
Every week when we talk, I talk to you about offering, and I tell you, hey, don't forget to give online, and don't forget to give online. And I continue to remind you what a blessing you've been to our church in this time. I want to encourage you more and more just to continue to remember to give online, because though we're not meeting together, our church is not closed, and we have not stopped throwing parties. This week, when you're watching this, the next 5 business days, we're going to throw 5 parties at 5 different banks just to tell our banker friends who have been working through this crisis, who have been essential workers, we're so thankful for you, to throw a party to celebrate people that nobody else is throwing. We're going to find some ways to throw parties and other essential workers over the next month. May is going to be all about us throwing parties for people who are working, who are grinding, who are doing everything they can right now to help us make it through this crisis. So what we need is we need you to continue to give. We need you to use the Church Center app and set up recurring giving so that you can automate the important things in life. We need you to give online at madisonhills.org. We need you to mail your checks in so that we can continue to bless people and to just throw party after party as the Party People Church. For the last 3 weeks, we've been doing this series called I'm Not Okay. And I kind of have been thinking about it a lot, because admitting we're not okay means we're messy people. And one of the hills that we live on as a church, one of the things that we will die for, is that we will die to admit that we're messy people, that we're broken, that we're hurting. And it's okay not to be okay. But because we're Jesus people, we also believe that it's not okay to stay that way. And so one of the things that we do regularly is we admit our mess and we admit our brokenness, but we also work and we strive to be more like who Jesus called us to be. So months ago, when I planned out this series, having no idea what would happen, we kind of have altered it and changed it. But one of the things I did, I've never done this before. This week, I went online to some groups of friends that I trust here at our church, and I said, I want to talk one more week about I'm not okay, but what am I missing? We've talked about I'm not okay because I have a past. We talked about I'm not okay, and Caleb was here and he talked about homosexuality and gender issues. We talked about I'm not okay because we talked about worry and anxiety. And so I asked my friends, I said, what are some other areas we're not okay in? And really, without any prompting, one of the areas that came up over and over again amongst the people that I asked was I'm not okay because I'm grieving. And what was interesting was it wasn't just one generation, it wasn't just one group. There were multiple people who said, you know what, there's a lot of grief right now. And what happens, I think, a lot of times is that we associate death and grief together. The only time anyone grieves is when someone dies. And I think that that's normal, but I also think that what happens is we forget to associate a lot of losses with grief. There are people who are grieving over lost graduations and lost senior years. There are people who are grieving over lost jobs and lost businesses. There are people who are grieving over the death of a loved one. People who are grieving over an addicted child or an addicted parent. There are friends and there are people who are grieving even over something as simple as a family vacation that's been lost. And see, here's the thing. I think one of the things we miss is that grief is not just for us. Grief is so often other people's process. And then it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've lost. I find what happens a lot of times is that when you're grieving, there's a loss and it stings and it hurts. But more than anything, that loss stays. and that it doesn't just go away one day. You don't just wake up without that grief. I think one of the problems we have is understanding the grief of other people. Because other people grieve in a different way. Other people grieve over different things. And so we write it off. But the truth is that all of us are carrying some kind of grief. And I know that if you're breathing air right now, if you're awake right now, there is a grief, there is something that you have lost or are in the process of losing. And I know that for you right now, you're thinking, maybe time will heal this wound, maybe it won't. Maybe for you it's been 20 years, maybe for you it's been 20 minutes, and you just think, I don't know. And you've heard the other people whisper, get over it. You've told yourself, it's time for me to get over it. But the reality is that the reason grief is grief, the reason that we feel this loss is because it hurts. And what makes it extra hard is, as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, you're allowed to feel grief, but you almost feel like, I got to get over it. It's not supposed to be hard. I'm a believer. I believe in heaven. I believe in Jesus. But the reality is that no matter what other people tell you, no matter what you might think, there's still some pain that comes with grief. And so maybe you had to cancel your wedding and you had to put all those plans on hold. Maybe you worked really hard and college graduation was around the corner. And now you're graduating on Zoom. Maybe you worked your whole life to build a business and you're worried that business isn't going to make it if this shutdown continues. Maybe for you, you're grieving that your grandparents just aren't around like they used to be because they can't. Maybe if you're like me, you're grieving that you can't drop your kids off at your grandparents' house and you really would like to. But it doesn't matter who you are. There's grief. It doesn't matter who you are, there's pain. And there are other people who would tell you your feelings don't matter, but you can't change that. It matters to you. Just last week when we talked about anxiety and worry, we talked about how we can't focus on the fragile. We need to focus on forever. And we talked about it, and in reality, it's not that easy because grief is real. I want to say this too before we go any further. Know that grief is a God-given emotion. And it's not something that we should repress or suppress. It's not something that we should be ashamed of. Grief is a God-given emotion that we can feel and express. One of the best authorities on the topic of grief comes from a guy named Rick Warren. You've probably heard of him. He wrote the book, The Purpose-Driven Life. And in The Purpose-Driven Life, he became a best-selling, famous author. But it didn't stop Rick from feeling grief. About 4 years ago, his own son took his life. And so Rick has very publicly grieved through the process of Matthew's death. And it's one of those things where you watch a man like Rick go through grief and you think he's got everything, but he still has pain. And one of the most important things he said is that grief is not a task, it is a process. And he said, additionally, grief is not a staircase to climb, it's a roller coaster to ride. And no two people will grieve the same. And so now, as a people in an uncharted territory and in a part of life we've never experienced or never expected, we're walking through the life of grief. And the reality for us is that it's painful and it's difficult. And it's okay to be grieving. Whatever that grief is for you, whatever that pain is you're feeling, whatever that sorrow is in your life, it's okay to feel this way. But we want you to know that we love you too much to let you stay that way. Together, we're going to look at two different passages in the Bible, and we're looking at two different stories of grief. One of them, we're going to focus on the griever. The other one, we're going to focus on dealing with someone who's grieving, on helping someone who's grieving. The first one, the griever, is the story of Joseph. And we always make sure you know there's two Josephs in the Bible. There's Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus. This is not him. This is Joseph, the other guy, the coat of many colors, the one Dolly Parton sings about. But this Joseph is born to a man named Jacob, and he has 12 brothers. And Joseph's 12 brothers know that he's the favorite, and they hate their brother. They hate him so much that they pretend he died. They sell him into slavery in Egypt, and they convince their father that he's dead. Eventually, Joseph climbs the ranks and becomes the second most powerful man in the most powerful country in the world at the time, Egypt. And when he becomes the most powerful man in the country in the world at the time, Egypt becomes the storehouse for the world. And eventually, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt in order to feed themselves because of the famine. And there's a beautiful story as Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and he forgives them and everything goes well and they bring Jacob, their father, back and everything is good until we get to Genesis chapter 49. And in Genesis chapter 49, as people do when they age, Jacob, Joseph's father, begins to die. And it's in Genesis 49 that we see that Jacob finally realizes his death. It says, when Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. And it's this moment. Maybe you've been there. Maybe it's fresh in your mind. This opportunity, this chance to say goodbye, but it's still so hard. And Jacob knows what's inevitable, but he's not changing. And he says goodbye to his sons, and he breathes his last. And then it says at the end of the verse, Joseph threw himself on his father, wept over him, and kissed him. I mean, you have to think about this. The second most powerful man in the most powerful country in the world throws himself on the bed of his father and is weeping at the loss of his father, who is ill, who is old. Grief is hard. Grief happens. In the Jewish world, it was customary to bury someone within 24 hours of their death. They would never embalm someone, but the Egyptians had pioneered the process of embalming. And so Joseph kind of sidesteps tradition. He has his father embalmed, and they travel with him 200 miles to their home in Canaan. And as they walk through Canaan, as they see it, these memories and this time kind of comes to this closure for Joseph, and he sees it. For 70 days in Egypt, the flags fly at half-staff. For 70 days, the family is off work. For 70 days, everything is different. And Joseph works through this closure, and he breathes through this anger. And you'd think, here's a guy with all the power in the world, with all the money in the world, with all the time in the world, and it takes him a long time to ride the roller coaster of grief. And you'd think somebody with power, somebody with money, this wouldn't be a big thing. But you see Joseph, and Joseph struggles. What happens is his brothers start to worry. Because now that their father's out of the picture, would this maybe be time for Joseph to exact revenge? In his grief, he could be angry because all of the time that he lost with his father came from the loss of what his brothers did to him. And so his brothers approach him and they go, hey, we cool? And they very well know that Joseph could just lash out at them, and Joseph could use his grief and use his anger to just ruin their lives. But Joseph says to them in verse 19, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. You see what happens? Is in Joseph's grief, he doesn't act out of anger, but he acts out of grace. He acts out of hope. Joseph knows that they follow and worship a God who is much bigger than their situation, who is much bigger than this moment, who is much bigger than this time in their lives. And Joseph offered his brothers grace in the midst of his grief because he had hope. Talking about grief practically is an odd thing. I don't have a lot of 10-point lists on how to overcome grief. I don't have a whole lot of information on the 5 steps you can take to stop your grieving. I don't. In fact, what I do have is I can tell you that Jesus grieves. Jesus himself weeps openly in John chapter 11 at the grave of Lazarus. And the people around him see his grief and they see his pain. We believe that Joseph, Jesus' father, passed away when Jesus was probably a teenager. And so we know that he dealt with the loss of his father at a young age. We know that this is a man who's not unaccustomed to seeing pain, to seeing loss, not unaccustomed to seeing grief. And he knows it and he feels it. So your grief is not unmerited. John Keble, the poet, says, tears are the gift of God to suffering man. And so this is what we want you to know, is that your grief, your emotions, your loss are okay. It's okay to feel the way you feel. It's okay to act in pain. It's okay to feel that hurt. But I also want to challenge you to let your grief be a testimony. The Message paraphrases 1 Thessalonians 4 like this. It says, you must not carry on over the dead like people who have nothing to look forward to, as if the grave were the last word. Since Jesus died and broke loose from the grave, God will certainly bring back to life those who died in Jesus. So if you're a follower of Jesus, if you place your hope and your faith and your trust in Jesus Christ, your grief should be different. And it's sad. It's sad to have missed your graduation. It's sad to have missed the closure of your senior year. It is unbelievably sad to lose a business, to lose a job, to go through the grief that you're going through right now. But I want to challenge you and I want to ask you that you can miss those things, but you can still choose not to focus on the fragile, but to focus on forever. You can still choose to have hope in the midst of your grief. The other side of this coin comes from, what do you do when someone around you is grieving? What do you do when someone around you has lost something? What do you do when you get to the point where you're looking at them and you're thinking, man, they really should just be over this by now? I don't have a pat answer for you. I do think that there are times that someone is so unbearably grieving that they need to spend time with a professional counselor. I believe that there are times where there's therapy that needs to happen for people who need it, but it's a hard topic to broach. But I think when someone is grieving, the best thing you can do for them is to be a friend. And one of the examples we see of that is in a guy named Job. Job's story is in the Old Testament in the book of Job. And what we find in the book of Job is we see a man who God calls blameless, but who loses everything. He loses his children, he loses his farm, he loses his livestock. And in the midst of all of that, at the beginning of the story of Job, we find a great example of helping someone in grief in his friends. Later in the book, they're not as good of an example, but for this point in the book of Job, we find them as a great example. Job has lost his children, he's lost his living, he's lost his family, he's lost everything except his wife and his life. And we read this in the book of Job. It says, when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. And so we have this moment. What do you do when someone's grieving? You plop down on the floor and you sit next to them. What do you do when someone's heart is broken? You sit beside them. And don't get me wrong when you hear this, because you're not God. But I believe that a lot of times the physical representation of God takes place of us sitting next to someone who's grieving. That the most physical and most comforting reminder someone can have of the ever-presence of God is a person who loves them sitting beside them without a word and just saying, I am here. I do have some practical advice. If you know someone who's grieving, if you know someone who has a loss, one of the worst things you can say to them is, if there's anything I can do, let me know. And I do it too. It's a bad habit for us to have. But what you're asking someone who's just been through the loss of a loved one is, hey, on top of doing everything else you're doing, why don't you delegate some tasks? One of the things you can do is you can show up to their house when it's socially distancing acceptable, and you can cook for them, you can clean for them, you can say, where's the laundry room? Let me take care, make sure you're caught up. When someone is grieving, you can sit with them, or you can choose to find a way to help them. There's an old book written by a guy named Joe Bailey. It's The Last Thing We Talk About. And Joe Bailey lost 3 children in 1 year due to unfortunate accidents. And he told the story of 2 friends. He said the first friend showed up, and he said, this first friend talked my ear off. So he reminded me about grace and about God and about God's will and God's plan. And he just preached and preached. And he said everything he said was right. He said, but then a second friend came. And he sat by me for hours. And he would hold my hand. He would sit near me. And we just sat together. And just said, I hated to see that friend go. See, the thing about platitudes, the thing about reminders, the thing about using them as teachable moments is that oftentimes, even though it's true, it doesn't stop the bleeding. Just because something is right doesn't mean we have to say it in that moment. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is sit beside someone in their grief. Sometimes it looks like a socially distant, totally appropriate hug. Sometimes it's just us sitting beside and letting them know we're thinking about them. Sometimes it's a message. Sometimes it's a word. Sometimes it's a phone call. I've been thinking a lot about grieving, right? And high school and college seniors who are grieving the loss of graduation. And for me, it's a hard thing to understand. And I'm watching as everyone shares their social media pictures of them graduating high school. And John Acuff said it's like showing a homeless person a picture of your house. And there's a thing where we want to help and we want to offer hope. And I can't help but think maybe for us what we can do is rather than show them when we graduated, why don't we just say, I'm sorry that you're missing this. I'm sorry for the hurt and the pain you feel. Diminishing someone else's pain doesn't make their pain go away. Maybe for you, it's somebody who lost a job, somebody who lost their business, somebody who lost a vacation, somebody who lost a friend. I don't know what it is, but maybe all you need to do is just sit with them and feel their pain. Rick Warren said that explanations have never eased anyone's pain. They say that when joy is shared, it's doubled. When grief is shared, it's halved. That's the beauty of sitting with someone. The beauty of having the hope that we have in Jesus is that we don't have to sit alone, that we can sit with others, that we can have the hope of heaven, and that we can share that hope just in physical presence without words. So here's what I say to you. If you're grieving the loss of a loved one, if you're grieving that your child didn't turn out to who you hoped and prayed they would be, if you're grieving the missing out on an opportunity that the virus canceled on you, if you're grieving on so many different things, here's what I want you to know. We're here to sit beside you today. We're here to share this hope with you today. We don't have all the answers, but we feel your pain, and we want to help. The reason that we have hope is because Jesus Christ went to the cross, and it's there on the cross that he hung himself, and he hung himself and was buried in the grave, and was buried in the grave for 3 days, and then he rose again to give us all hope that this life is temporary, that the things that we're worried about, that the things that we've lost, that the things that we're missing are temporary, and that what he has to offer is eternal. And so your hurt, your pain, your anguish can forever be eased by the hope of Jesus. Thomas More wrote this: "Come ye disconsolate, where'er ye languish, come to the mercy seat and fervently kneel. Here bring your wounded hearts, here tell your anguish, for earth has no sorrow, heaven cannot heal. Joy of the desolate, light of the straying, hope of the penitent, fadeless and pure. Here speaks the Comforter, tenderly saying, earth has no sorrow, heaven cannot cure. Here see the bread of life, see waters flowing forth from the throne of God, pure from above. Come to the feast of love, come ever knowing, earth has no sorrow, heaven can't heal." Today, as we close and we sing some more songs together, I want to offer you the opportunity to know the hope of heaven. If you want to follow Jesus, if you want to know more about Jesus, we'd love to hear from you about what it would take for you to make that commitment to Jesus and make him the Lord and Savior of your life. I want to challenge you as we sing this next song together to find something in your house that represents the bread, the body of Jesus broken for you, that represents the cup, the blood of Jesus poured out for you. And I want to challenge you to use these moments to remember that Jesus died so that your hope, so that your trust, so that your life doesn't have to be in things, but that your grief can be softened by the hope of eternity with him. Will you pray with me? Father God, we thank you and for who you are. We thank you for the opportunity of your life and of your love. We ask that you would be with us as we continue to navigate these waters, God, and that you would show us that you are the path and that you are the way. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
People come together, strangers, neighbors, our blood is one. Children, generations of every nation, our kingdom come. Don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth, God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Oh, 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 oh. our salvation is in His blood. Jesus, light of heaven, friend forever, His kingdom come. So don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Get your eyes on this one truth, God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. Sing wide, all you heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. Our creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. All His children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Swing wide, all you heavens, let the praise go up as the walls come down. Our creation, everything with breath, repeat the sound. For His children, clean hands, pure hearts, good grace, good God. His name is Jesus. Don't let your heart be troubled. Hold your head up high, don't fear no evil. Fix your eyes on this one truth, God is madly in love with you. So take courage, hold on, be strong. Remember where our help comes from. 2, 3, 4. Before He spoke creation, God of heaven knew our names. From His perfection, we are the glory on display. His heart is good, He's always kind. Cross He proved He's on my side. We are the sons, we are the daughters of God. No matter where we go, we're close to the Father's heart. And though we stumble, we will not let us fall. We are the Lord's and He will never forsake His own. We are the sons, we are the daughters of God. His love lavished on us, all His children of the King. His love is loving of night. Remind me you're always by my side. When the lies speak louder than the truth, remind me I belong to you. When I can't see past the dark of night, remind me you're always by my side. We are the sons, we are the daughters of God. No matter where we go, we're close to the Father's heart. And though we stumble, He will not let us fall. We are the Lord's and He will never forsake His own. We are the sons, we are the daughters of God. We are the sons.